shop just off Bond Street.
Oh, yes, I suppose you are correct,
Lady Susan sniffed.
As I was saying...
He kept one ear on Lady Susan's monologue while his thoughts drifted off again, this time to the French dressmaker. He'd visited Bernardine a few times when he was in London. He liked to practice his French and other skills with her, but once he married... There was no need for any of his habits to change when he married, especially not if his wife was Lady Susan. She'd likely thank him to take his male lust somewhere beside their marital bed. And he was going to marry Lady Susan, if she would let him edge a word in. He'd never met a woman who could talk so fluently about nothing. Do I really want to wed such a jabberer? No, he didn't, but he didn't have much of an alternative. She was the best of a bad lot. His mother had laid the matter out quite clearly the moment he'd set a foot back in Darrow Hall after almost 10 years abroad. He had to marry and get an heir as soon as possible. He'd been in Paris when he'd got word that Walter had broken his neck going over a jump. Zeus, he'd never forget how he'd felt when he'd read that letter. It had been as if someone had administered a flush hit to his breadbasket and followed it by dumping a load of bricks on his head. I never expected to be Earl. I never wanted to be. He'd liked the life he'd built for himself. He'd spent the last decade in Portugal, Spain, France, Austria, living by his wits, dealing in ideas and stratagems and politics, not in crops and drainage ditches and leaky roofs. But he was the Earl now, and with that came the duty to continue the succession. And Walter's death had proved all too conclusively that no one was guaranteed another day on this earth, which Mamma had pointed out most emphatically. He needed an heir, she'd said bluntly. There was no time to delay. Walter had been only 35, and here he was, dead. And, as Walter had also illustrated all too well, Harry couldn't be assured of having a son on his first attempt, or his second, or third. His sister-in-law, Letitia, had produced a baby a year. Adriana, Bianca, Cassandra. Likely she and Walter would have carried on through the alphabet until they'd got a boy, if she'd been able, but she'd lost the last 3 pregnancies, and then, if rumour was to be believed, had refused to let Walter back into her bed. So, Mamma had handed Harry a list she'd made of eligible women, young females with the proper pedigree and several brothers. All he needed to do was choose one, marry, and get done to swiving his brains out. Well, Mamma hadn't said that last part, at least not in so many words, but her message had been painfully clear. The sooner he got an heir and a spare, the better. She'd wanted him to make his selection on the spot, picking a name off the list, but he'd insisted on meeting the women first. They'd all still been in the schoolroom when he'd left England. So they'd compromised. Mamma had agreed to let him take a season to shop the marriage mart without constantly badgering him, and he'd agreed to make his choice once the season was over. The season had ended in June. He hadn't encountered a single woman who made his heart, or even his baser organ, long for a closer relationship, but he'd given his word. He had to choose one. Lady Susan would do as well as any other. Better, perhaps. At least she was in her early 20s, older than most of the others on the list. Mamma would have preferred he choose a debutante. She'd argued that he'd get more breeding years from a girl in her late teens, but he couldn't stomach the thought of taking what to him felt like a child to bed. And since, as far as he could discern, Lady Susan harboured no tender feelings for him, she wouldn't be offended by his inability to feel any affection for her. He only hoped he didn't go deaf from her constant chatter. At least she was pleasant to look at, and Darrow Hall was a big place. It wouldn't be hard to avoid her there, and when he was in London he'd spend all his time at his clubs, except for the obligatory swiving. With luck he'd get her with child on their wedding night, and their first 2 children would be male. Lady Susan's fashion commentary showed no sign of abating, but time was marching on. He could feel his mother's and his sister-in-law's eyes boring a hole in his back. It was the last day of the house party. He was supposed to invite the woman for a stroll in the vegetation.